Association Historical Committee, I would like to welcome one of our distinguished lawyers here in Nashville for an oral interview, Nashville attorney Tom White. We asked if he'd be kind enough to sit for this oral presentation, and he graciously agreed. And he has a fascinating story that we all need to know. Tom, welcome. And you have been a fixture here in Nashville for decades upon decades. Could you share with us, to begin with, some of your formative years?
First of all, Hal, I appreciate the commitment of time that you've made to do this today, and I appreciate the members of the historical group that you work with so often do so much preservation and recollection of history, which is so important for the bar and the city. With respect to formative years, I was born in New York City. My family moved around quite a bit. I ended up going to college in New Orleans, where I met my wife Sandy, and then came to Vanderbilt Law School. And I was very fortunate in that I was on an all-tuition ride at Vanderbilt Law School, and that certainly made it possible to come to a very high-quality law school, which I clearly could not have gone to were it not for that all-tuition scholarship. And I must say, just as a side note, that full scholarship was funded by Joe Binkley, Joe P. Binkley Sr., and it was known as the Joe P. Binkley Scholarship, and it was a full tuition scholarship that gave out one every year during that period of time. And I would always come downtown once a year to Mr. Binkley's office in the Parkway Towers building and thank him for allowing me to get through law school.
I did not know that. What was the criteria for obtaining it?
Just had to be a really exceptional student and athlete. I'm just teasing you. They looked at academics and they looked at extracurricular, and I had a good academic record, as a lot of other folks did. But I was the president of the student body and was the university's undefeated boxing champion, and had other things that a lot of other people had. But I think there was kind of that eclectic mix as was an appeal, and I was very, very fortunate. And as you and I have talked on many occasions, we'd always far rather be lucky than anything else, and that was just a stroke of good fortune, because at the time I never really thought about Vanderbilt Law School, and I certainly, when I was there, never thought about staying in Nashville. But the city and the lawyers here clearly grew on me, and I've been very appreciative of that relationship through today, and flattered to be included in this interview today.
Well, you omitted one big job that you had, which we valued very much at Vanderbilt, and that was that of a dorm advisor.
You are kind, and I have to say, when I was offered the full tuition scholarship, it was Dean Beasley who was the contact for the school at the time. And I told him that I couldn't come to Vanderbilt because I didn't have the money for room and board. So he said, well, I've looked at your resume. You were a dorm advisor at Loyola for 3 years, which was undergraduate school. And he said, let me talk to K.C. Potter, who was the dean of the students. And, you know, we're always flattered. It was just a different era, but I got a call from K.C. Potter, who was the dean of students, and said, if you would be the head resident advisor for Cassam Quad, which was 6 dorms in a quadrangle down there called Cassam Quad, that'll take care of your room and board. And I think it paid like $20 a month or something like that. But that absolutely ensured that I would go to Vanderbilt, and I was ever appreciative to get the call. So that took care of tuition, room and board. It was a lot of busy work for 3 years, but all good.
Well, some of us went into the laundry business and made a little more money. Were you in that group?
Yours was a cash business.
Well, tell us about your parents. Were they from New York City?
Yes, my dad was a CPA, went to Fordham, was a decorated World War II bomber. That was, as I think it's so aptly described, as the greatest generation. But he was a decorated World War II pilot that flew the required 45 missions, was taken out once and landed in Yugoslavia, but he was one of that group that did the Romanian oil runs, where they gave these pilots, 2-for-1 credits because it was such an unbelievably risky mission. But my dad was, I think, 22 and was deemed to be one of the older pilots at the time, but 22. And the casualty runs at Ploesti were, 50% most of the time, because you had to get down low enough to get below the German aircraft, but if you got down too low, it was the Romanian oil fields, it was the guts of the German oil refineries. And if you got down too low, the planes blew up because of the heat. But he did 2 of those Ploesti runs, but, you know, was out of the service in 44 and just thrilled to be back home. And he was engaged to my mother at the time, but like everybody else in that generation, they put off getting married until see if he came back from the war. So he did, and they got married. And my mom was from a small town in Kansas of less than 1,000 people. And so, to her credit, they moved to New York City, where he stayed as an accountant. He taught at Fordham, where he had graduated and worked for newspapers up there. And then we moved around the country from New York to Michigan, where my dad worked as a comptroller for the Detroit Times. And the big papers then were the Times, the News, and the Free Press. And when they closed down, he didn't want to work for a competitor, so we moved to Wichita, Kansas, moved from there back to Des Moines, Iowa, which was the home of Kohl's, the Midwest branch for Kohl's, which was Luke Ski Art in America. But it was always in the publication business. And to my mom's credit, she's the one that always helped the 5 kids pack up and go. So I think for me, Hal, what that did was it made you land on your feet quicker than others because you went from school to school to school. And you just had to make friends in a hurry. And that's basically what that movement did to me in those formative years. I had really good parents. They were really disciplined, capable people who believed in hard work, but really decent. And so I just really was gifted with those formative years when I think about the good background that I was given by my parents.
You know, I think a lot of people don't understand that moving around a lot, I mean, there's a lot of sadness where you have to give up your friends and so forth, but it's such a learning thing that you have by moving around and going to different schools and seeing different things. So I understand exactly what you're talking about. So you get out of law school, Vanderbilt, you graduate, what year?
I got out of Vanderbilt in 1972, and Sandy and I were married in my 3rd year of law school. And I have to laugh and say, I talked to you about the tuition and the room and board at Vanderbilt, and about the same time I started law school, my dad was hired by the Tennessean and the Banner to be the director of finance. He was hired by Eamon Evans and by Jimmy Stallman. And so he had been there a couple of years by the time I got to my 3rd year, and I went to him and I said, Dad, look, I'm really totally committed to Sandy. I want to get married, but I don't have the money for a ring. And so as we talked about that, I said, don't you find a job for me down at the Newspaper Printing Corporation where I can just earn the money for this ring? Me, of course, hoping for a cake job in light of everything. Well, the cake job that he got for me was working down there at what they called the press room, which is where you stuff the papers manually. And that's what we did for 10 hours starting Saturday night at 6 o'clock, and you worked till generally 5 or 6 on Sunday morning. But literally what you did was you put the filler in the paper, and you opened up the Tennessee and put in the filler, and they went down the line. And the papers ran over your head down there in that room. And so hour into the night, you were absolutely filthy dirty. But I said to my dad, when I got enough money to get a ring, which took me maybe 6 months, I said, Dad, that's the best thing that ever happened to me, because I guarantee you I will never quit law school, and I will never, ever want to do anything else, because I'm never going back to a job like that again. So I was really hoping for a crib job, and that's what he gave me, and I wasn't really appreciative at the time. But as time went by, I was, and I think I've said to you on many occasions, Sandy White's the best thing that ever happened to me, so it was all worthwhile.
Thank God for unanswered prayers.
It was unanswered, trust me.
So you got out, and did you start practicing law immediately?
I did, and I had the good fortune of working as a student assistant to Tom Shriver, who was then the district attorney, who you did know so very well and worked for and with on so many occasions. But I was a student assistant, and in my 2nd and 3rd year of law school, the commitment was you had to work 20 hours a week in the DA's office. So me, Gordon James, Jack Olson, and then later Ed Yarbrough were student assistants there. I didn't see much of Ed. We kind of passed because he was Vietnam and coming back a little bit later, but worked 20 hours a year in that DA's office. And the thing that strikes me about that time in my life is that, and you've worked in situations like that, both as a former U.S. attorney, where you form relationships with people you just can't in the private practice of law. I've got very close law partners, but when you're working with a group like that, in an office like that, whether it's the district attorney's office, United States Attorney's Office, Attorney General, whatever, the people that were good to me and I had a relationship during that period of time, if I see today, it's like a throwback to that 40 plus years ago, and that's Sissy Daughtry, you know, who went from Shriver's office, you know, to the Court of Criminal Appeals, to the Sixth Circuit, you know, incredibly talented person. I saw Sissy, as you did, at the bar event last Friday, so never slipped a beat right there. Bobby Schwartz, Tommy Thompson, you know, people that you just, if you saw, there's never ever missed a beat. And some of the other people that I don't see quite as much, but people that came out of that office, Randall Wyatt, just really, really relationships you can't ever replace. And I miss that in the private practice of law, because no matter how much you treasure your law partners, their spouses, kids, et cetera, you just can't be quite as close as you were in that group. And so I missed that part of it. But when I graduated, I decided it was not in me to be a criminal defense lawyer. I liked what I did over in that office, but at the time I interviewed with two people. One was John Toon with the firm I'm with now, and the other was Lamar Alexander, who was with a firm called Dearborn, Warner, and Alexander at the time. Interviewed with both of them, and John Toon was just a consummate salesman. He's an absolutely first-class guy, very bright, very capable. And Lamar Alexander and I had in common that he was a Ruth Tilden Scholarship at New York University. And I was in that program as a Ben Snow Scholar, accepted into that program. And they offered 2 of those to each of the judicial districts. At the time there were 10, so there were 20 of us across the country. And I just, it was strange. The Ruth Tilden program was a program, Hal, where you had to commit that you'd live in a Ruth Tilden dorm, and you couldn't get married in law school. And I just thought, you know, I'm on the cusp of dating Sandy, and the Ben Snow program, which is part of the Ruth Tilden program, was a great honor. It was prestigious. And Lamar was in the program ahead of me, so interviewing with him, it kind of gave a common bond. But it was just so obvious to me that John Toon and his personality were a place that were a far better fit for me, and I was very appreciative of talking to Lamar and being able to work, or offered to work at Dearborn, Warner, and Alexander. They went on to become a great law firm, Dearborn and Ewing, as you remember. And for a while, they were the 3rd largest firm in town behind Bass and Waller. But for me, it was the absolute perfect fit to be in with John Toon. So I went immediately out of law school into the service. And when I came back out of the service, I had prearranged I was going to join John, and it was John and General Howard Butler, Jack Butler, Bill McHugh, over there on what was the 14th floor of the Nashville City Bank and Trust building. That was the top floor of that building, and every law firm in town was either in the Nashville City Bank and Trust, right next door to the American Bank and Trust, or the Stallman building where you currently reside. So every law firm in town was there, and that's where I started practicing. And I've laughed on many occasions. I told you, Sandy and I were down there at Sculls last night in the alley, and I pointed up there and I said, I just have to always remind myself that we were going to move from the Nashville City Bank and Trust to the First American Center. We did in 1974. But for the first year and a half, while we were planning the move, me and 2 other lawyers, Charlie Leach and Richard Davenport, shared the library together because, of course, we were moving soon. There was one phone in the library, and we would rotate about who would get the call. And so if it was your turn, you got the call, you got the client. So we all hovered around that library desk every day, and it was a fun time, but it was kind of a time where you really wondered when the next case was coming in and what you were going to do. But a very interesting time. But John Toon and Jack and General Butler were the 3 people I worked with the most, although I did quite a bit with Bill McHugh at the time as well.
Well, when John Toon offered you that job, how old were you?
I was 25.
See, that was an amazing thing, that John Toon would be offering a 25-year-old a position. He saw in you, obviously, great talent, because that was highly unusual to do that. An older lawyer here in a big firm inviting some 25-year-old to come on board. It was like Jim Neal and Aubrey Harwell, same thing.
You've mentioned that to me, Hal, and I appreciate that compliment. At the time, people were still just generally sharing office space. And that was true of General Butler, Jack, John Toon, Bill McHugh, Tom Watts was up there. You just shared office space. And then within 5 years, it became clear that that was somewhat of a dying art, where you couldn't do everything anymore. You couldn't draw wills, litigate.
But that's what we did. We
That's
did
what-
everything.
That's what everybody did. And there came a time where there was a little bit of a reckoning where you couldn't quite do that anymore. And on the most amicable basis, General Butler and Jack decided they would leave. And then that's where we formed Toon, Entrekin, and White, which was 1978 or 41 years ago. But it was just, it was a different time. But I, to this day, have the very best memories of General Butler. He was so decent to me. And John Toon and Irvin Entrekin were like big brothers to me. They were both approximately 20 years older, and both very much in the establishment. You and I have talked about that, but I was very flattered that John and Irvin made that proposal to me, and I was thrilled to accept.
Well, so what did your law business evolve into?
Well, the one thing I've always shared with you that I always like to comment about is, as long as the law business is a people business, I think it's absolutely wonderful. We've gotten way too mechanical about a lot of different things, but I really appreciated that ability to start, as you and so many others did before me, doing a lot of different things. And so you gravitated into doing a number of different things, which I appreciated, because I think it taught you, here's the areas I really want to go into and not go into. And we've talked about cases before, but that was a driving factor to me. John Toon and Irvin Entrekin were big brothers enough that I always wanted to please them, although we were all partners. I just wanted to always show them I could do my very best, and it was like, trying to please your parents. They were both really decent about giving me things to do. John was doing a lot of litigation, Irvin no litigation, but it was just fun to get out there. It was probably a more fun time to practice law than it is right now, just because of the camaraderie among the lawyers and the different cases that you might have. And then with respect to cases, early on, John Toon took me over to the home builder's office. I think it was 1973. I think I'd been out of school 6 months. We went over there, and of course they were interested in John Toon representing them. So we went over there together, and John made the comment to the board that we were thrilled to represent them, and that he or I would be at their meetings every month. That's the last time the home builder saw John Toon. And so that was a relationship that allowed me to have a very close relationship with so many of the active residential builders in the town, who at the time were the people like Marion Thurman, Randall Phillips, Reese Smith, just really Jim McLean, just really influential people, John Eddie Kane, that formed a personal and business relationship for me. So that, I think, the bulwark of our law firm's practice has generally been a representation of builders and developers, residential, commercial, and doing the other related things for them. So that's kind of how it took off, and I found out in a hurry that when you did a piece of zoning work or a piece of litigation over zoning, you'd probably do that 10 times residentially for every time you do it for a big commercial developer. But it was the same drill. So by the time you had it down to a science, doing that for so frequently for those residential builders, then you get a call by a Bobby Matthews or a Walter Nestrick on the same type of issues, zoning and or the litigation from it. And you just had it down pat because you'd been there so many times doing the same thing, same people, same courts. Almost all these cases tried in the Chancery Court, and you were down there frequently enough that when you got a call on a much bigger case, it was really very mechanical almost, because you knew exactly what to do and how to present cases at the Planning Commission, Board of Zoning Appeals, and you knew where to take the case into the Chancery Court. So I felt for the longest time I was really the only lawyer in town that really knew how to do those zonings at the Metro Council, go to the Planning Commission, and if things didn't work correctly, go to the Chancery Court, where you know what your odds were prevailing. And that's something that became, pretty common for me during those years.
Well, it's one of the reasons you are known as the go-to guy in that area, and all of Middle Tennessee and maybe all of Tennessee. You have that reputation, and you're held in high esteem in that area. Well, did you go in, as you're going through this practice of law, did you get any bar activities?
Yes, and that was another real benefit that I learned primarily from John Toon about that. John Toon died in 1983. He was 52 years old, just a really extraordinary person who had
April,
as you well remember. And John, that year was the president of the Tennessee Bar Association. He had been the first and only chairman of the Airport Authority, which he basically helped create through the legislature and when Dick Fulton was the mayor. But he was very active in bar activities. So to answer your question, I was on the board of directors of the bar twice. And the second time was the president of the Bar Association, which was 1996. But early on was the president of the Young Lawyers, or as you and I called it, the Barristers Club. And so they were all great activities, great friendships. And what you and I learned also was it was so much of a chance when you dealt with people on a personal basis that when you had lawsuits against them, you could go talk through a settlement, or at least if the bell was going to ring, you'd come out and understand what the other person was all about. So people that don't participate in the Bar Association miss a tremendous amount.
No question about that. You were president of the bar at one time, weren't you?
1996.
1996. Who was on your board?
Matt Sweeney was on the board. Cliff Knowles was on the board. Claudia Bonneman.
Good board.
Just a really active work. John Kelly was going off. Tom Carlton came in shortly thereafter. But just a really good bunch of lawyers, good people.
Did that hurt your law practice?
It was absolutely a real plus to the law practice. Number one, all of us, to be honest, are a little bit ego-driven, so you're nice to be able to say president of our association, president of Barristers Club. But the personal relationships went way, way beyond that, where it just helped you. I think it helped you mature, and you're around people. You and I have talked about people before, like John Toon, like John Kelly, like R.B. Parker. They made you a better lawyer. And if you're smart enough to learn from other people, that's what I think the Bar Association activities did. And you'd have those trips on the houseboats, where we would go, General Butler's boats, go up and have a good time, great camaraderie. It was just all, it's a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle that I think we're getting away from, unfortunately, but it was a great chance to participate. And as I said, I was not a native to Nashville. My wife was from New Orleans, and so it really allowed you to get involved with people like John Toon, who was very accomplished in his own right, Jack Norman's son-in-law. It was just a really chance to meet different people and really end up making a really good life for you and your family.
And back in those old days, we had the Nashville Bar picnic out at the Hobbs Farm, which is amazing that more people didn't get killed.
Well, if you'll remember, one of John Kelly's claims to fame was his job was always to bring the dice. And he did, without fail.
And there you'd see General Sessions judges gambling, and the next day handling gambling cases in the court. I remember that so well. Well, back in those days, who besides folks in your law firm were your mentors?
Well, I want to state again, John Toon and Irvin Entry were absolutely big brothers and could not have been any more valuable to me as far as mentors. Outside of that circle, I'll single out John Kelly. John Kelly was another one. He was probably 20 years older, but an absolutely tremendous mentor that I really did learn so much from. And like John Toon, unfortunately, he died early. Bill Ortell at that same law firm. Bill and I tried a number of cases against each other, became really good friends, and he and his wife and Sandy and I ended up doing a number of dinners together, et cetera. But Bill Ortell was just, he was a prince. He was a real prince. And I think about other lawyers in the community that were doing things. A person that I really was not close to, but I learned so much from, was Doug Fisher. Doug Fisher, I found, was hard to get close to.
He was.
But he was a very capable lawyer, and you could learn a tremendous amount from Doug Fisher. And of course, we both went to his services within the last week or 10 days. But he was somebody that, he was a mentor, but not in the same warmth category. You know, he was just a very capable lawyer that you could learn so much from. And I, in part, had the same type of relationship with Tom Higgins, Judge Higgins. He and Ovid Collins were on the other side of a couple cases from me, and they were not warm and fuzzies, but they were people you could learn so much from, and Tom and Ovid tried so many cases together, and I had, you know, the good fortune to try cases against them on maybe 2 or 3 occasions where they were class lawyers you could learn so much from. So I tend to think in that group, hell, that's probably the people that I think had the most influence on me at that time in my life.
It's quite a group, and a group of very strong men. I must say that our friend Doug Fisher died within the last month, and it was just before that when I heard he was sick, I called him, and we talked about old cases and laughed and so forth. And then he said, you know, Hal, I've run a good race, and I'm ready to go. I got all my affairs in order, and I'm checking out of here. You know, what a man, what a man.
What a class way to make the comment and mean it. I mean,
He meant it. He's very sincere.
No small talk with Doug Fisher.
No, that's for sure. Well, what about, you mentioned Judge Higgins, any other judges that you liked? What about L. Clure Morton?
I have to say, of judges, we've got a really quality bench in Nashville, both federal and the state level. And of judges that stuck out in my mind that I just really had a great relationship with and really appreciated. On the federal bench, it was just obviously L. Clure Morton. I mean, he was a real taskmaster. You did plenty of cases up there yourself and knew him. He was just absolutely not just a good taskmaster, but he would, upon occasion, help out a younger lawyer. And I certainly had that experience with once or twice, one of which the cases involved you. But I just always appreciated that he was very disciplined, but he wasn't afraid to try to reach out to younger lawyers, help them along. He didn't like any arrogance, he didn't like pompousness, but he would reach out if he felt you were willing to learn, he was there to help. And at the state level, I think probably, although so many capable judges over there, the judges that I really formed a relationship with were Judge Ben Cantrell and Chancellor Kilcrease. For maybe a shorter time, Justice Strwoda, but at one point it was really Justice Strwoda and Chancellor Kilcrease and Ben Cantrell over there. And then I just have to say I thoroughly enjoyed trying cases in front of Bob Brandt. Bob Brandt was on the Chancery bench about 20 years, and I tried a significant number of cases in front of him, and he was always very pleasant to be in front of. But of the Chancery bench, that was primarily it. And in the circuit court, we've all tried a lot of cases over there, but Judge Brothers in the Sixth Circuit was always somebody I really enjoyed trying cases in front of. And he's still on the bench, and he came out of the Norman office, as you're aware. But those are the judges that, I guess, the ones that you're in front of more often you have a little better affinity with, relationship with, and those are the ones that kind of jump out in my mind. And of course, Judge Cantrell, as he left the presiding judge of the Court of Appeals, came with our law firm where he was for 8 years, and he was just an absolutely great law partner, great mentor to all the young lawyers, period. And I must say aloud too, Judge Frank Clement, when I first tried cases in front of him, he was in the probate court. And I tried a lot of really significant cases in front of him. They were not jury cases, but he was always very bright, very plugged in, and now doing a very capable job at the Court of Appeals, having taken Ben Cantrell's spot as the presiding judge. So those are the ones that kind of crossed my mind, Hal, as people that, you know, you just got to spend enough time in a courtroom with somebody to kind of get vibes and feel about it. What I've always liked is, you know, what a judge likes and doesn't like, and some lawyers are not smart enough to realize some things you do and some things you don't do, and they step into it repeatedly, and to the benefit of people like you and me that are smart enough to step back and figure out what the difference is.
The great thing I think about Elclore Morton, he'd bark a lot, and he'd lay down his laws and so forth, and he'd be tough. But, you know, if he was wrong and you kept after him and you knew you were right, he would say, I'll reverse myself. He was that sure of himself. Nothing phony about the man.
And he was absolutely, what you saw was what you got.
What you got.
And he didn't care, been practicing law 30 years or 30 days. He was just, you know, straight from the bench, as you and I remember from some of his cartoons.
Well, you tried so many cases, and we can't talk about every one of them, but would you kind of give us the highlights of some of the more interesting ones that came down your way?
Well, let's see. Just somewhat chronologically, I've thought about this a little bit. And like every lawyer that's tried many cases, there's lots of stories lawyers can tell, but I think the Polk versus Revlon case in 1975 is one that sticks out for me. Tried it twice in front of Judge Morton, jury trial. The first case you were involved in, a very intimidating experience for me with Jack Madden, who was the king of products liability defense in the district court.
No question.
Nobody touched Jack Madden. And he was smart enough to try that first time we tried it with a hung jury. He was there with Hal Hardin and indirectly Jim Zwickel. And so that was a hung jury. But that's the one that sticks out in my mind for a couple reasons. One is Hal Hardin and Tom White waiting for the jury, throwing pennies against Judge Gray's courtroom door at the other end of the 8th floor.
Bored.
Which was, just kind of waiting for the jury. The second one was when the jury was out, Judge Morton called you and me and Madden up to the bench, and he said, I want to show you this cartoon. And the cartoon was from some publication he got, and the jury foreman was back, and the jury foreman at the bottom of the clip says something like, Judge, we've been out for 2 days, we decided it's none of our damn business, which Morton would just take great delight in.
And they had 3 for the plaintiff and 3 for the defendant. None of our business.
None of our business. Oh, and that was, to my knowledge, the jury verdict the second time around when you were not involved was only $5,000. This was $75,000. But I was just thrilled to have a judgment against Revlon. And to my knowledge, that was the only products liability case Revlon ever lost with the jury.
I think it was, and it was one of the most important for Mr. Revlon because the product in question was Ultima 2, and that was the name of his yacht in New York City. It was the Ultima 2, and he did not want us to lose that case.
I remember, well, it wasn't lost on your watch, Hal. He was a hung jury with you, but yeah, you told me years later about his Ultima 2, and I finally understood that was his boat, no wonder he was so. But that was 75. I think 1980, I represented Porter Wagner against Dolly Parton, and that was just a real experience. Both incredibly capable people, talented folks. People forget that Porter Wagner was the big star at the time. His show, Porter Wagner and the Wagoneers, was on 20 years. It was the longest standing country music show in history at that time. And it was a breach of contract case, very simply, and I think Dolly got some very bad advice from some lawyers in Los Angeles. But, you know, here's Porter with a 3rd grade education. Dolly comes out of high school in Sevier County, but unbelievably street smart, both of them. And both just really class acts. But out talking about Bob Brandt, 2 things in that case stick out in my mind. One is that under the contract, Porter got a certain percentage of Dolly's earnings if she ever left his show. And that really meant nothing when Dolly left because she started moving with her own family back with the Parton family, Stella and some others. But then came along 9 to 5. And all of a sudden Porter picked up his contract, thought, hey, there's some real money here. But part of it was he got a certain percent of her income. And so at some point, I sent out some discovery asking for her income tax returns. And the lawyers in Los Angeles wouldn't give it. And they were just not good in judgment. Stan Chernow was the local counselor, was an excellent lawyer. And he was urging them to do it, but they wouldn't do it. So I filed a motion for contempt against Dolly Parton. And I'll never forget Bob Brandt saying from the bench, the press was right there in the courtroom, and he said, I think Dolly Parton's got a great reputation, but if she doesn't give these tax returns as requested, I'll put her in jail just like I do anybody else. The Associated Press carried that as a byline, and like within a week that case was settled. I mean, it was a real clear message. They were going give the tax returns, and they were going to settle, which they did. But she was always total class act to me, as I've mentioned to you, and just humorous stories in different cases like that. That's the one where, when it was settled, Dolly didn't have the money to pay the judgment at the time, and so there was a life insurance policy on her life, which she wasn't happy about, and those two had not been getting along, had been in altercations, and so at some point, I was trying to explain to her late one night as we're settling the case that she didn't have the money to pay the judgment, and she said something like, Tom, you know, we haven't been getting along, and there have been problems, altercations, et cetera, and I gave her a great legal answer, which is, you know, look, you cause the death of somebody in Tennessee, you don't get the benefits. And she just looked right at me and said, Tom, I'm not worried about you, I'm worried about Porter Wagner, he doesn't know what the law is. And it's just this street smart, but that was Porter and Dolly. And
Well, tell me, did she write that song, I'll Always Love You, about Porter Wagner, or did she just pen it about somebody else, or just pick it up out of the
I always thought she penned that for him. And he did, but my observation was, at one point, I mean, they're extremely close. And, you know, Dolly Parton's got an unusual voice, very talented.
Yes.
And Porter had a lady named Norma Jean that was the, quote, woman star on the show, and she decided to go raise a family in Oklahoma and left. And that's when he hired Dolly. And, you know, she's got an unusual voice. He was very helpful in trying to figure out how that would blend into different things. He was a very talented, street smart type of person. So, but to answer your question, I'm virtually positive. My observation for sure was that she penned that for him.
Well, what about the Father Ryan City of Oak Hill?
That was a very interesting case, and one of the major land use cases that gets cited all the time. That was a case where I was asked to represent the Catholic Diocese to establish a high school out there in Oak Hill. And of all the different cases that I've been involved with, whether it was the location of a high school or a quarry or a landfill, that one just generated perhaps the most friction and animosity I can remember. Some of the folks in Oak Hill were just not happy about that. And what strikes me, and I remember about that case, is that we won in front of Chancellor Kilcrease, went to the Court of Appeals, ultimately the Supreme Court prevailed, and it's a first-class high school that's been out there. Absolutely great result for the diocese. But I remember when we finished the case that I sent the representative of Father Ryan out to get the building permit from a guy named Bud Morris, who was a city manager in Oak Hill. And as I said, this has been an acrimonious case. And so I got a call, guy's name was Randy Campbell. He called me from the city hall. He said, you won't believe this, I just met Bud Morris. He said, we're not giving you the building permit. I said, what do you mean? He's not aware of the Supreme Court ruling. He said, no, he does. But he said, quote, you Catholics are like the blacks in the 60s. You always want to be somewhere you're not welcomed. And I said, what? Did he really say that? He said, yeah. I said, will you give me an affidavit? He did. So we're in front of Chancellor Kilcrease. So I filed a petition to hold Oak Hill in contempt, and Chancellor Kilcrease just ripped them a new one. The permit came out, but I'll always remember that statement. It was just a classic. But I'll say this to the credit of Bud Morris, he never denied it. As the years went by, he had every chance. You know, in today's politically correct world, somebody, I really didn't say that, maybe it was taken out of context. He said, no,
It happened when I was young.
Yeah, he just, but in that same era, that was the Marion Thurman case against Channel 2, which I thought was a very significant case. And again, that was like 1983, and it was Marion Thurman, I think, had been disparaged significantly by General Electric through their local affiliate, Channel 2.
Now, Mary Thurman was a big builder here in Nashville.
He was probably the second largest residential builder in Nashville, and the person that did the interview against him just built up this incredible dislike because Thurman would not talk to him. The guy's name was Hank Allison, if you remember, worked at Channel 2.
Right.
Eventually went to law school, as I recall, but they ran like 15, 18 stories over and over again, blaming Thurman for all the problems, which were not Thurman's problems. So we sued them. It was in Chancellor High's court. Jury came back, and they gave $100,000 to Marion Thurman. It was then, and I think still is, the only jury verdict against the broadcast media in Tennessee. And that was, and I have to say this to the credit of Pat Nolan all the broadcast media were there in the courtroom when the jury came back in. And it was 2, 4, 5, everybody was there. When the jury returned the verdict, which they did in open court, everybody left but Pat Nolan. Nolan reported the story. The others never said one word about it, not one word. And so, but anyway, that was a case, and I want to say to Marion Thurman's credit, he gave almost all that money to the rescue mission here. It wasn't a matter of money. He just didn't want the press to get away with how they had badgered him, and they were just very, very unfair about it, and often thought they were above it. But that was very interesting. That was ballpark 1983.
What about the Beeman estate matter? That was a pretty famous case.
Thanks. Hell, your memory's getting better than mine on some of these, but the Beeman estate was a horrible dispute among family members where basically the children had taken Mr. Beeman to go to get a will done. And at the time, Alvin Beeman, an incredibly successful person in the Pepsi business, the car dealerships, any amount of other investments. And I think his estate was probably valued at about $200 million. This was, in the late 80s. And the children basically took Mr. Beeman downtown, and he did a will where he didn't give a dime to his wife, Sally Beeman, who was his wife of 53 years. And as you well remember, at that time, I will call it the statutory four-share, but there was basically, a third would basically go to the surviving spouse. And I got a call from Sally Beeman, and I'd never met her, just knew who she was, and she told me what had happened. And she said, I just want you to know that I'm a very easygoing person, but I've been married for 53 years, this doesn't seem right. And she said, I want you to know why I'm calling you, because one of my daughters and I got into discussion about this, and she said, we live in Belmead, you're not going to want the publicity, you're never going to do anything about it. And she said, I thought about it for a day, and I decided I am going to do something about it. So she called me, and it was a case that involved some of the really great lawyers here in Nashville. Aubrey Harwell, Ann Davis was working with them at the time, Cecil Brandstetter, Bobby Lee Cook was involved in the case, Bill Leader, still a very capable lawyer. But it took the better part of 2 years, and at the end of the day, Sally Beeman ended up with a little more than half of the estate, and it was a just result. It was a very just result, but it was always one of those where, and I have to laugh, I became close to Alvin and Sally Beeman. I was a pallbearer for her, but at some point, we had Sally and Alvin Beeman out to our house where you have been up at the top of the hill. And Mr. Beeman was a Pepsi, dyed in the wool. Absolutely, there was no other drink on the planet. And I had successfully brought in Coke for the night.
Oh my.
And I have to say this was not the best received, but my kids always remember me running around and grabbing up the Coke bottles and getting rid of them. But they were just really fine people and lived in peace for the rest of their life. I just hated to see that acrimony in the family, and it just shows you, money oftentimes just brings out the very worst in people.
It truly does. And what about the Hoover rock quarry case?
The Hoover rock quarry case, a couple of different matters. I think 3 of those cases went to the Court of Appeals. All of them out of a Chancellor Brandt's court. But the Hoovers owned a very successful quarry out where the new north-south runway was at the time, and the airport decided they needed that property for the new north-south runway. And of course, this is decades ago. And American Airlines was going to make Nashville the hub, which they did for the shortest time and then basically pulled back on it. But it was a case that involved a tremendous amount of money as to what that was worth. And the Hoovers, to that day and now, have just become good friends as well as clients. And most recently, within the last 2 years, they established a quarry out on Burnett Road, which is out by Old Hickory Dam. And that, to my knowledge, is the first case under the Tennessee Vested Rights Act. The Tennessee legislature passed the Vested Rights Act, which was, I think, just a matter of fairness, where if you had a certain zoning in place and basically you did the right things, you were locked into it. They couldn't take it away. Because historically what would happen is if you announced what you were going to do on a piece of property and it was zoned correctly, the first thing the Metro Council or somebody in the legislature do it, downzone your property. And that was the law in Tennessee, where unless you had a building permit and spent a considerable amount of money in reliance on it, they could just downzone your property. It's kind of hard to believe. You could have a prime piece of property in Green Hills for an office. And if you hadn't started, somebody could come along and rezone that to agricultural. Zero remedy, zero remedy. So in this Hoover case, we knew the act was in the bill. We made sure the property was correctly zoned, which it was industrial, next to the old DuPont plant, and made sure everything was in a row so that we could claim the vested right. We did, and of course, the first thing the Metro Councilman in that area did was downzone the property, so you couldn't do a court. Well, we prevailed on that case, and it was Judge Davies came over here, tried the case in Chancellor Perkins' court, and was affirmed by the Court of Appeals. But that's a classic case about a vested right. And to my knowledge, there may be other cases since then. That was the first reported case on the Vested Rights Act of 2014.
Well, what about the Peronini case involving the construction of the stadium?
That was a very interesting case. Perini built the Nashville Arena. They were the general contractor. Huge dispute that ended up involving like 9 or 10 other parties. And we eventually got it down to 3 parties. It was a 7-week jury trial in front of Judge Bob Eccles, who was a senior district judge at the time. It was a good result, but there was also a very good result for Gareth Ayton, a friend of mine and yours, who represented another one of the parties in the case. But I said then that was the longest jury trial that I had ever been involved with, and really didn't want to do that again. We all like jury trials. We all like pieces of litigation, but that 7 weeks down there in the district court ended up being a real drill.
Well, tell me, how has the law changed, or has it changed since the time you started practice and the way it is now? Or
Well,
the practice of law?
I think, in my opinion, it's become far less personal. And you and I have got a lot of friends that we have dealt with for many years. We've commented about several of them today. But there was a time where if a lawyer really said to you, my words, my bond, they meant it. And some of the lawyers you and I have talked about here, R.B. Parker comes to mind, a great defense lawyer. If you sent something to them in writing confirming an agreement, they were highly indignant. And I only did it a few times and learned didn't do that, especially to a certain number of lawyers, where if they told you something, that was it. And that's no longer true. That's no longer true. And in filing for sanctions and things like that that are most detested by the circuit and chancellors and the district judges, that just didn't happen nearly as much at the time, because you just wouldn't think about doing something like that. And if you did, a law partner or a mentor or somebody would tell you, absolutely, you just don't do that. And so I miss some of the professionalism, where some of the younger lawyers don't have the mentoring, don't have the colleagues, and some have stepped into it unwittingly, although some, I think, probably shouldn't be practicing law when you see some of the things they do. It was also a time that you will remember when a lawyer did something wrong at that period of time, the Bar Association and the Bar President prosecuted the case.
That's right.
Lance Bracey would have been the head of the disciplinary board. Tom Higgins, in part, involved for the Bar Association. They would bring the charges against that lawyer, and it was all done on a gratis basis. It was done as a gratis basis by the people bringing the case, and for those of us that represented some of those lawyers that got into trouble, it was a gratis thing by us. It's just the way the bar worked. You tried to step up and make sure there was a discipline at the bar. We self-governed, and it was a little more disciplined at the time. And so I miss that about it. I sometimes sit in a motion dock and I hear some lawyers say some things, and I think, my heavens, man, have you talked to anybody in your firm about that before you came over here? It's different. And I miss the size of the bar. At times when you started practicing before me, there were 300 or 400 lawyers at the bar. Now you got 3,000 lawyers. You can't have the personal relationships that you once did. And I really dislike the lack of personal contacts, in that oftentimes you were mentioning bumping into somebody in the alley the other day, sitting down for 2 hours talking about something. Lawyers don't do that anymore. They just don't do it, whether it's with a client, they don't do that. And sometimes I hear from lawyers doing insurance defense things that the clients that they represent don't want them talking to other lawyers. They want them sitting behind a desk, sending things back and forth, papering a file. And I just, to me, when it quits being a personal business, I don't want to practice law anymore. And I think we're losing some of that. Although, with a little bit of effort, it's still, in my opinion, a tremendous profession. I love practicing law. I love the clients. I love the eclectic things you can do. Practicing law, the contacts you can make, what you can do for your family, very importantly. But I miss the personal contacts that just are not there anymore. And I think if somebody says they still are, I don't think they're being accurate about it.
Well, there used to be several watering holes where lawyers would meet, or in the morning at the Stallman Building for breakfast, and we met quite often, and we kept in touch with each other, and our wives and family knew each other, and you couldn't get mad at somebody because you see them at church or at a ball game, and we don't have that anymore. And one other comment I'd make is, you know, the president of the bar, if a judge wasn't doing right, he'd pay him a visit and say, you know, I'm hearing this. And it meant a lot, and it straightened out a lot of problems. And I can't imagine that being done today.
I can't either. And you mentioned the Stallman Building. They'd have the round table at the Stallman Building, you know, where you'd have some of the real capable lawyers, colorful lawyers would come there. And then I think it was Judge Tom Higgins that made the comment that part of the problem is lawyers didn't get together and drink whiskey like they once did. And I think that's so true.
That's exactly right.
Just a leveling field.
If you had it to do over again, you'd still be a lawyer?
Absolutely. And you know, you just have to be thankful. We talked about, you know, what you're appreciative of in your life. And you made a great comment about Doug Fisher and how he was so much at peace. And in my opinion, I'm very clear in my mind about the law profession's been an absolutely great ride for me and my family. And the contacts and friendships I wouldn't trade anything for. And I kind of put them in this order as far as appreciation. I have the highest and number one appreciation for my wife, Sandy, whom you know very well. She's just been absolutely, unbelievably great, committed spouse to me. And without that, it's extremely difficult. We live in a pressure business. And the second part of it is just have to be honest enough and say luck. I mean, just luck plays a huge part in our life. And then the third piece is hard work. I think I've thought about that a little bit in advance of this, and those three things are just total honesty by me. All three of them critical to me.
And Tom, I'm so glad that you mentioned R.B. Parker, because I regret to report that he's in hospice and is not doing well, and probably will pass in a day or so. He was a great man. It's good that he's remembered while he's alive. Good man, and he helped this bar a lot. You and I, well, a lot of people agree on that.
I told you, we used to call it the R.B. Parker Specials. He was a great insurance defense lawyer, very, very plugged in. But he was kind enough. He's one of those people you go talk to, and he'd say, "Now look, White, here's what you need to be doing here," and it meant something. It wasn't fluff, but he'd tell you, "You got to do this and this, and if you put this together, the R.B. Parker Special, I'll see if I can get this settled for you." And so if you dealt with it in the mind of somebody who was trying to reach out to you as a younger lawyer, it was just invaluable. But he was just a great lawyer. Tried a world of cases. He was like the Bill Moody's of that time, you know, where they just tried so many cases. The Doug Fishers, I mean, just tried cases, of which we don't do nearly as much anymore with, you know, the cost of litigation, mediations, arbitrations. But R.B. Parker, he was a jewel.
And he lived hard. He had friends in Justice Douglas on the Supreme Court. He'd go hunting with him all the time, and with John Hooker Sr. and a lot of those older gentlemen. And it was quite a club they had. Well, tell me, are you reading any good books?
I make a point of trying to read, and I guess of the recent reads, I won't pull up the titles exactly, but the book on Perry Wallace, absolutely.
Inside Strong.
Yeah, Inside Strong, absolutely great read. absolutely great read. And I'm trying to think through, my law partner, John Williams, is a prolific reader, and generally, at least once a year, he gives me a book that he wants me to read, and then, of course, he examines me about the contents after we do. But he has given to me a number of great reads, and I'm trying to think through in the legal field itself. He has given me books that deal with presidents of the United States and what their different feelings were about the country and things like that. And it puts a different perspective on how you practice when you consider at a certain level how people look and say where they are in different things. And so I have to say I love to read. Don't get to read as much as I would like to, but I'm finishing a book now about World War II, which means something to me, especially like it does a lot of other people because of my dad. But it's been some time ago. But the books that will resonate with you, The Greatest Generation, Brokaw, it just makes you realize how fast this life gets by, and how people hung it all out there. These young pilots, infantry people, whatever else, at 19 to 22 to 23, that put their life on the line and never thought about it. They were never looking for anything when they came back.
It's just amazing. I'm reading the definitive book on Churchill. Must weigh 15 pounds. It is so heavy and so thick, but it is just jam-packed with information that you're talking about.
And one of the books John gave to me that I just finished is the story of Churchill's life. And I mean, his personal life was a disaster, an absolute total disaster. And in some respects, his kids were a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
But he was at the right time in the right place. And I think that's for candid books about people like that, whether it's, some people have Winston Churchill up on a pedestal, not realizing a lot of different things that happened in his life. But then you just realize, there's a time and a place, whether you call it our finest hour or whatever, just people are at the right place at the right time.
Right.
And I was almost startled when I read through some of the miserable things in his personal life. But, from the Boer War to wherever else, he was a survivor. He was a survivor.
Many failures, many victories. Well, what do you do for fun, Tom White?
Like you, Hal Hardin, I've got a 100-acre farm out in Dixon. You've been out there. It's an absolute great escape. My wife, Sandy, has 3 horses. She loves to ride. She loves the horses. And so almost every Friday night we'll be out there. And then this last week, I'm the horse boy. I trailer the horses and move them around. They're kept in Leaper's Fork most of the time, but I'll bring them down there for a week at a time to our property in Dixon. And so I love to get down. I love hauling the horses for my wife. I love riding the horses down there. But I found, as I told you, that women are probably 90% of the owners of horses in this country, and they take so much better care than men do. I love to ride. My idea of riding is get the horse out, put the saddle on, and take off. That's never acceptable to Sandy. They got to be groomed and cleaned, and et cetera. But the ladies, and Sandy in particular, they'll muck the stalls out, they clean the horses. But to me, that's an absolute great escape to get out of the city of Nashville. Dixon County, it's wide open, just like your property. You're out, you get therapeutic, get away. But I love to have the horses down there. I love to get on the four-wheeler. I'm down there every single time I'm down there on the four-wheeler. I just love to get around on the property. And I love to see things done on the property, whether it's fixing up a barn or whether it's, doing something down there. The Turnbull Creek comes around on our property. I just love to be away. And as I said, I was born in New York City. Never thought I'd ever be having a farm down in Dixon County in Tennessee. But I just appreciate that escape, and to me it really is a total escape. And I, like you, spend too much time at work, and so that escape to me is just absolutely invaluable.
Well, as we have mentioned before, bush hogging is the most godlike thing you maybe can do on earth. You're creating and destroying at the same time, and that's godlike.
The bush hogging, the mowers, especially when the equipment starts. Sometimes that's the highlight.
Well, how long do you think you could do that and not come back and practice law? Think you could retire doing that?
I don't think so, Hal. I mean, I think about it. I love being down at that property, and I'm tapping the brakes in the practice of law. Unless it's something really critical, I'm not down in the office on the weekends, and I leave, if at all possible, by noon on Friday, and some Fridays I'm just taking off. But I don't know, the law has been enough of my life, I just don't know that I would ever fully retire from it. And maybe, in fairness to my wife and kids, maybe that's something I'll give a little more priority to. But I anguish about it. I really anguish about that because I have a wife that's been there for me constantly. And there is a time where you just got to give a little more priority there. And I want to do that. But I just don't know if I'd be content. I'll say this, if I was thinking about doing that, I would basically sell our house in Nashville, get a condo downtown, and then go between the condo and the farm property, because I would always want to have the farm property.
But you always want to stay in contact with the city.
Yeah, there's no question. I want to do both of those, and it's worked very well for me, just like it has for you. But I feel so committed about the fact that I'm not worried about the name of the law firm, Entrekin White. They can change that the day I leave. It doesn't mean anything to me. I might be flattered if they kept it, but that would never drive me to have any ego deal about what they might do when I left. But I care for the lawyers that are there. I have been and still am the rainmaker for the firm basically since John died in '83. And I enjoyed that role, but I enjoy getting cases to other lawyers, working with them. And I'll miss that part of it. And you and I both know it's difficult to practice law just part-time. I don't know, you ever say, I'm coming in one day a week, dude. I just don't think it works that way.
I don't know how you do it.
And so, in fairness, you don't want to die at your desk either. And you and I, when we started practicing law, that's exactly what most lawyers did. You know, you never left the firm, whichever the firm was, and you kind of just grew old at your desk. I don't want to do that. And the other thing that I know is that none of us are 21 anymore. You got to be honest enough to say, on whatever age I am, I'm not on top of my game as I once was. I'm not willing to work like I once did, and figure out a way where you just look in the mirror and realize, you know, that there's a time in your life where you can't work as hard, don't want to work as hard, and yet you can't quite give up the fight. And that's something I anguish with.
Well, some old lawyer told us once long ago that law is a zealous mistress. And she is. It's hard to give her up.
That was in part our good friend Rutherford. He would always make that comment. Law is a jealous mistress. And I can see him saying that to you and me both.
Well, Tom White, we certainly have enjoyed it, and thank you for sharing these experiences with us.
Al, thanks for doing this, and I'm flattered. And I want to say thanks especially to whoever in the historic group took on this program, and to Gareth Aden, who was persistent about trying to get something set up. And you know, you're flattered, number one, and number two, you just want to figure out, do I really want to do that? And I just have appreciated the persistence by Gareth and you in getting this set up. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Appreciate the friendship.
Thank you.
Now they'll come in and tell us the film didn't come on. You guys got to do it again.
I'll be happy.